Again, I'm Michelle Martin, host, special correspondent, blah, blah, blah. And we are going to talk about some stories from the field, and our focus is the worldwide wealth gap. And so, back in the day when we actually had, rules about what should and should not be discussed in public, what did we say? Sex, religion, and money. Well, we're going to talk about all of that, so. With two of my amazing correspondents. You're going to hear that word amazing a lot this weekend, and unfortunately, that's the word that is the right word. Gregory Warner has climbed mountains with smugglers in Pakistan for This American Life. He's descended into illegal mine shafts in the Democratic Republic of Congo for Marketplace's Working series. He lugged his accordion across Afghanistan on the trail of the Afghan Elvis for NPR's Radio Lab, and then clearly because he wanted a less stressful life, he decided to head to East Africa, where he covers terrorism and the region's incredible economic growth. He grew up in New York City and the New York suburbs. Gregory Warner, we're so glad to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Lourdes Garcia Navarro, Lulu, is a familiar voice to most of you. She's now based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But before that, she served as NPR's correspondent based in Israel, reporting on stories throughout the Middle East. She was one of the first reporters to enter Libya after the 2011 Arab Spring uprising coverage, for which she deservedly received some of the industry's most coveted awards. Before her assignment to Jerusalem began in 2009, she served for more than a year as NPR's Baghdad bureau chief. And before that, she spent 3 years as NPR's foreign correspondent in Mexico City, reporting from that region as well as on special assignments abroad, which was a bit of a homecoming for her because she was raised in Miami. Although the truth is, we can say all of her assignments are a homecoming for her because she was raised all over the world. But of all of her achievements, the one her female colleagues are most proud of is that there is a handbag named after her. And it's a really cute one. We're going to hear from Greg first, and then from Lulu.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's just make sure this one works. There's a little, in the spirit of public radio, last-minute editing. Okay, great. So this is my second trip to the States in 1 year, which has made my parents happy. The first time was in August. I was here covering the U.S.-Africa Summit. It was a wonderful opportunity to put on the A section, the top section of Morning Edition, and All Things Considered, some of the stories about Africa's rise. The GDP growth in sub-Saharan Africa is 6% a year. The middle class is growing. Middle class defined as making between $4 and $20 a day. So if you're making more than 20 bucks, you're rich, and you're probably starting a business in the emerging fields of technology and mobile banking. The fastest growing class, though, in Africa is millionaires and billionaires. And it's a class more overwhelmingly made up of politicians, senior government officials, and military top brass. The salary of a senator in Nigeria is $2 million a year. Compared to the incomes of their constituents, those lawmakers are making the most money, the highest salary of anyone in the world. Kenya is second, Ghana is third. So when we talk about the African 1%, we're really talking about the political elite. And that can be very, very unstable in ways in which you all will be very familiar with. First, you have that African story where wealthy politicians hire thugs from the reservoirs of poverty to create violence, to sow ethnic tension and ethnic violence, which of course rallies one's ethnic base, intimidates the opposition, and you attempt to win an election that way. The situation in South Sudan is what's happening there, and Central African Republic. But second, the ultra-rich are not so vulnerable to the economic shocks that crisis and chaos can bring. So I've made 3 trips to South Sudan this year. My last one was paddling down a makeshift river in a coconut bark canoe, and never having seen an economy eviscerated so totally. Farmers weren't going to the fields. the traders weren't showing up at the markets, and the people were digging up water lilies to find something to eat. But the oil was flowing, and so the war continues. Now, this is an old African story. As I've said, you've all read those headlines. And in fact, what the kind of violence that America is more interested in right now on the continent is one that we would put perhaps in a very different box, and that is fundamentalist terrorism. I'm speaking about Boko Haram in Nigeria, which kidnapped more than 200 schoolgirls who were studying for a physics exam. Or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, who attacked shoppers in Nairobi, Kenya. What I've found talking to people caught up in these events is that they define the terrorist attack and the terrorist threat in very different terms than the ideological ones we use in the West. While we speak about radical Islam, they are much more likely to describe it as woven into the fabric of the political violence that I described, fueled by income inequality. So I just want to go through one example of that and tell you what I've learned from that. In this June, Al-Shabaab attacked a Christian enclave on the northern coast of Kenya, sort of right near Somalia. And it was a place called Mpeketoni. They killed more than 50 people, and they said it was like last year's attack on Westgate Shopping Mall in retaliation for Kenya having troops in Somalia. And that's how it was covered in the Western press, as an act of international terror. But now, I say Western press, I would usually count myself as part of the Western press. In this particular case, I was on my way to Mpeketoni when I was caught up in a car crash in Uganda, and so instead of ending up on the white sands of Kenya, I was here on my couch. So I was a bit late to the deadline on this story. I didn't get to Mpeketoni until 4 months later. But as a result, I got a chance to talk to locals, not in the grief and chaos of first impact, but in the more reflective aftermath. One of the first people I met was this guy, John Wanyeke. He's the owner of a beautiful hotel. It's called Breeze View Hotel. It's got an Italian kitchen imported from Milan. At night, June 15th, he heard the sounds of gunfire in town. Like many people thought it might be a robbery, until looking down at his courtyard, he saw 8 men enter, dressed in camouflage and with turbans, speaking Somali, and carrying a large suitcase, which they very calmly placed down in the center of his courtyard, opened up and began assembling a rocket-propelled grenade, an RPG. But then these Somali terrorists, who of course he had never seen before, did something even more terrifying. They dragged out his receptionist. Fortunately, this group was not killing women. They slapped her around and they asked her for John. They said, "Where's John? Where's John Wanyeke?" They asked for him by name. And in fact, many of the people I met in this area of Mpeketoni said these terrorists had an uncanny knowledge about where different elites lived and whose house was whose. So if you ask John, and you ask his neighbors, they do not say this was an act of international terrorism. To them, this was local. This was personal. This was an outgrowth, there's John again, he was telling me, this is an outgrowth of long simmering tension between local Muslim communities and their Christian neighbors who are ethnically aligned with the central government. And they would say that those relative newcomers now own some of the best hotels and the best real estate. This is not a conflict at all about how you observe your religion. It's a conflict about land, conflict about political power. And in this region, there's a $5 billion port project, an oil refinery being built, which has raised the stakes massively. So you can put yourself in my position. I come to cover this event. I'm confronted with these two seemingly irreconcilable narratives. One is Al-Shabaab, taking credit for the attack. It's a notorious terrorist group. They even have an explanation for why they did it. On the other hand, the locals I'm meeting there, and even the Kenyan president, is saying, no, it wasn't Al-Shabaab at all. Al-Shabaab was just hired guns. It was the local Muslim opposition politicians, and Muslim politicians who have no ideological affiliation with those fundamentalist groups, but rather have their own interest in sowing violence and division. So this would seem to be sort of one of these narratives. One of these narratives would square exactly with the way we in the West talk about terrorism. The other narrative is a more convoluted web of allegations and conspiracies. So it's not hard to imagine which narrative gets privileged in the Western press, but the experience of covering terrorism in Africa, which I've been doing for the past year and a half now, is to be confronted always with these two narratives. Just for one more example, I was in Nigeria. A pair of explosions went off in a market, killing almost 100, mostly women, selling vegetables and food in that market, as well as their children, and injuring many others, like this mother and child that I met in the hospital. The extremist group, Boko Haram, took credit for the attack, but again, the local business officials local business leaders that I was meeting, as well as local academics, were saying, no, this is about next year's Nigerian election, and local politicians fueling divisions before that. And the same twin narratives were at Westgate Shopping Mall last year. So I found myself over this period basically expanding the theater of my questions vis-a-vis terrorism. I'm from New York City. As you heard, I was there during 9/11. I suppose 9/11 has been my model for what a terrorist event is, and we all know this model, the clash of civilizations model, I think it's called, where you have an extremist followers of Quran attacking the tenets of secular Western democracy. But when I would meet relatives of kidnapped schoolgirls, or shoppers in a mall in Nairobi, or just people trying to make a living in Swahili Coast, they don't see these terrorist events as attacks on their democracy. They see them as evidence of the failure of their democracy. I think back to my interview with John Wanyeke, the hotelier. After the terrorists asked for him by name and then torched his hotel, he jumped out of the third-floor window, managed to leap over the fence before they shot him, hid the night in the forest, in the bush, listening all night to the sounds of destruction, explosions, gunfire, screams. But his greatest horror, in a way, was the following morning realizing that throughout that long night, not a single Kenyan police officer had shown up. No army platoon had shown up, even though there's a base right nearby. And to him, that is the greatest evidence that this was, at least in part, an inside job.
It's sad. It's sad. It was very sad. You can even feel like there is no government. You feel hopeless in times of, like, if you think another time like this will come, you feel hopeless.
I don't want to end this talk on a hopeless note, but I do think that hopelessness can be as contagious as extremism. And terrorist events that are brutal enough or deadly enough to merit the attention of the West, and they're not many, because there are hundreds of terrorist events that happen on my beat that I don't report on for NPR. But when it does hit that bar, it is very natural to be fascinated by the evil of the actors. And they revel in our fascination. My colleague on the continent, Ofebia Quist-Arcton, is just in Nigeria right now, and she's reporting that the leader of Boko Haram, the group that kidnapped the schoolgirls, is now saying that those schoolgirls have been converted to Islam and married off to fundamentalist fighters. And in fact, this guy even adds on his YouTube video that if you knew the state of your daughters right now, you would die of grief. And in a way, he's speaking to all of us because of the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag, which swept across the globe. These in a way, are all our daughters. So it's an important project to understand the appeal of that kind of evil in the world. And there are many, many experts, many of them right here in DC, that have devoted themselves to understanding the terrorist mind and the terrorist mindset. But if you pay attention to Ofebia's latest report, what she keeps coming back to is the disappointment that Nigerians feel with a government that seems never to have taken the fate of these girls seriously. And the question that she raises in that report about whether the Nigerian president is playing politics with those girls and with that event. I think that disappointment is hard to fathom if we don't understand that its context in the Nigerian history of violence and African history of violence as a political tool. So I think this is good news for us, because we as a country, the United States, has never been very good at countering the appeal of fundamentalism. But the African 1%, the political elite, they are the people who our government most frequently engages with, who our corporations in the increasing investment in Africa are dealing with most directly. So if we can expand our focus from the evil that terrorists do to the hopelessness that they inspire, we might put more pressure on those elites to take that hopelessness seriously too. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Hello?
If you want,
Just making sure you can hear
You
me.
can use the podium if you want.
Yeah, I think I might actually
Go
use the
ahead.
podium. So let me do that for a second. We're going to go to a very different part of the world. I'm going to take you there right now. Brazil. I didn't want to defy your expectations here of the country where I live and work. We have a picture here of this year's contestants for Miss Boom Boom, which, as you can imagine, chooses Brazil's best butt. I really want you guys to take a really close look at this picture. Really look at it. Guys, I know that's going to be difficult. I knew it was going to be hard. But I want you to look at it, and I hope you see what I see when I look at that picture, which is the following. Almost all of these women are lighter skinned. And we'll get back to these ladies in a moment. I'm going to explain a little bit about Brazil because not a lot of people are familiar with it, even though it is such a huge place. Brazil has billed itself as a rainbow nation, and indeed, there are whites that are descended from the Portuguese and the most recent waves of immigration from Italy and Germany, and of course I had to get a picture of Giselle in there because she is obviously the face of Brazil in so many ways, and that's how Brazil markets itself. This is how it wants the world to see it, Giselle. But of course, there are the indigenous who were there before Brazil became a country, and Japanese. The largest Japanese descendant community in the world outside of Japan lives in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But 52% of the country is of Afro-Brazilian descent. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to give up slavery. It was in place until 1888. That's 20 years longer than the United States. Brazil was also the country that imported the most slaves. 4 million slaves came to Brazil. What we are seeing here is a visual record of one of the most violent periods of slavery, the end.
Late 19th century, even more brutal than before, because slavery was ending, was about to end, and slave owners want to get as much as they can in terms of slave work. They're not concerned anymore about surviving. So who cares, you know? I need to get my money back.
That was Maria Elena Machado. She was a historian. She helped curate a exhibition that I reported on last year. It was an extraordinary exhibition. Brazil actually has the largest trove of slave-era photographs in the world because that last 20 years of slavery coincided with the rise in photography. And so you see these images that you do not see anywhere else, and it is incredible. But apart from those images, one of the things that really struck me so forcefully when I did this was something articulated by another of the curators that day. His name is Sergio Burgi.
People here in Brazil reacting in ways that are very interesting, saying, oh, that reminds me of my time as a kid where I used to live in a rural area, that everything looks similar.
Similar, he's saying. People are talking now how things still look similar to pictures that were so long before. I think one of the things that struck me so forcefully is that I brought my Brazilian producer to the United States, right here in DC for the first time. And for those of you who live here, you know that this is not a city without its racial tensions. And we went out to a restaurant. It was nice, it was upscale, nothing special, but it was a good restaurant. And she looked around and she said, wow, there are black people eating in here. She found it remarkable. That's an extraordinary statement about the state of Brazil today. This is what you see in Brazil. More often than not, in upscale restaurants, you see people, Afro-Brazilians, doing the serving and not being served. I'm explaining this racial reality to dispel some fundamental myths about Brazil, but also because when I was asked to do this talk about global inequality, I wanted to talk about it in a different way. The way we think about inequality, it often is about money. Who has money? How did they get it? Who doesn't have it? Why? And that's an important way to think about inequality. You know, Brazil has been rightly celebrated for bringing millions of people out of the lowest rungs of poverty into the middle class in the last 10 years. You know, the income of the poorest 5% has actually grown more than 5 times than the income of the richest 5%. And that's an incredible testament to what has been happening there. But does having more money mean that you treat people more equally? I would answer that in Brazil specifically, the answer is absolutely no. So let's think about this differently. And I'm going to bring you back to Miss Boom Boom and the contestants here, because I had to put the picture in twice. Inequality can be about, for example, what is considered beautiful in a society, what is considered desirable, and what that means in terms of access.
E na nossa cultura, os modelos que têm valor.
In our culture, the view is women who look acceptable get money, social mobility, power.
That was Marcelo Silvio Ramos. He's an anthropologist and social scientist, and I interviewed him on a story I did about plastic surgery. Brazil is a world leader in plastic surgery. It has recently surpassed the United States. And he suggests that women who don't look the white way are shut out. You rarely see, for example, white women on the cover of magazines. Here's a kiosk just outside my house. And that question about access, what does that mean, really? Remember, 52% of the country is of Afro-Brazilian descent, but only 8% of the Congress is of color. So the poorest may have more money to buy things like iPhones and have television sets, which they have now. It's become an avid consumer culture, but they still don't have access to the halls of power. And this is another way to think about inequality. In Brazil, increasingly, it means, do you get to live or die? I'm showing you a picture of 14-year-old Mateus Alves dos Santos. Last June, the day before the World Cup, he was taken by the police, along with 2 of his friends, to a secluded hilltop on the top of Rio de Janeiro, and he was killed point blank, shot in the head by the police. And we know what happened to him because one of the local broadcasters was given the police videotape. The police didn't even think to turn off their cameras inside their cars. They didn't think that it was anything unusual to be doing something like that. There was a recording of the police talking about how they were going to kill the boys, and then after shooting one of them and leaving the other one for dead, one of them escaped, they said, that's 2 down, we're going to meet our quotas for lowering violence and criminality before the World Cup. And you can hear it all on the tape, it's extraordinary. You know, Brazil is one of the most violent countries in the world. Think about this number, 56,000 people were murdered in Brazil in 2012, 56,000. Now you think about America and all its gun violence and all the discussion that we have here. In this country, 15,000 people died, and this is a much bigger country. So this is the thing about Brazil. Those statistics, those 56,000 people dying, they hide a color-coded truth, and it's this. The country's actually gotten a lot safer for white people. In the past decade, murders among whites have decreased 24%. But among the black population, it's increased 40%.
Those who are white tend to be able to, for themselves and avail themselves of greater security, and we're seeing reductions in homicide. Those who are black, who aren't able to, as our societies become more and more unequal, are less able to secure those public goods, and as a result are seeing homicide rates going up.
That's Robert Mugga from an institute in Rio de Janeiro, a think tank on security. The white enclaves are protected by this brutal police force. 1,900 people were killed by police in Brazil in 2012. 1,900. That's an average of 5 people a day.
The elite and the upper middle classes, in a way, tolerate a kind of repression and, in fact, fuel it and seek it. And I think that there is this sense amongst the whiter populations of Brazil that the black population are the source of much of the vice and decay and violence in society.
So I'm going to take you now with me to one of the most violent favelas or shanty towns in Brazil. I went there last week to speak to the father of this young man. It's called Maré. It's in Rio de Janeiro. It's vast and poor, and it's dangerous. And as its name suggests, it's located on the sea. It's also what the locals call under occupation. Getting into Maré is a really weird experience. This is the sound of Maré. A very vibrant place. Our local contact made us roll down the windows. The interior light of the car has to be on, but the headlights have to be off, because you're driving past all the drug gangs on the streets, and they want to see who you are, and they want to make sure you're not from a rival gang that's trying to infiltrate. You have to drive very slowly. You have to keep eye contact with them so you don't look shifty, but not look like you're too interested, which is actually surprisingly hard. But patrolling this area now is the army. The army is in a place in Brazil. The Brazilian army is actually patrolling its own citizens. They are in tanks and armored personnel carriers and heavy weapons. It felt to me, who's covered the Middle East, like I was in Iraq all of a sudden. And there have been, of course, many abuses reported by the army. And the gangs are still there. They just don't deal drugs like they used to right on the street. Now they stand on the street corners and they just do it inside. They have their weapons inside, they have the drugs inside, and you have these vast movements of military coming in and out of the town. And this is where that 14-year-old boy grew up. A place with tanks, a place with gangs, a place where only 1% of the population has gone to university. So what does that mean for you here? You know, you're sitting here in DC, it's a beautiful restaurant, you know, beautiful hotel, it's a wonderful place. We are in the wealthiest country in the world. So I'm going to take you now back to Robert Muga.
And so what I often say is Latin America represents, in some ways, a kind of canary in the mine for the rest of the world.
He basically is saying that as the world becomes more unequal, as the United States becomes more unequal, we may be looking at a future that looks a lot like Brazil.
So we've taken you to Africa and to Brazil. So now let's go someplace else.
Banks got bailed out, we got sold out. Banks got bailed out, we got sold out. Banks got bailed out.
Remember this? Remember this? This was the sound from one of the Occupy protests in New York City. They started in New York in September of 2011. For those of you who live in New York, you probably remember this very well, or people who work downtown. For months afterward, there were highly visible protests and encampments in cities around the country, certainly here in Washington, D.C. The actual encampment was kind of in between where we are now and our old office. It was in McPherson Square. It was there for months. There was also Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Boston, and elsewhere. You know, we like to think that these kinds of protests happen in other places where governments don't work, where everybody knows that the government doesn't work, or that they are utterly exclusionary or so corrupt that they have no legitimacy. But when Occupy happened here, what became clear was that whether you agreed with their message or whether you even thought they had a message, and of course a lot of people disagree with that, it just became clear that these protesters were tapping into a strain of something that is real in American life. Well, how do we know that? Well, you know, we have reported amply, as have other news organizations, on the numbers. We have reported on the whole issue of wage stagnation. We've reported on the aggregation of wealth in certain sectors. But one of the things that we do that's a little different than a lot of other people do right now is we listen to people's stories. We listen to them tell their stories. And so I want to tell you one story. This is Deborah Dickerson. If you are a person who follows blogs, you might remember her as one of the rising stars of the post-civil rights blogosphere. An Air Force officer, Harvard Law School graduate, writer of a best-selling memoir. I'd been following her on Facebook for quite some time. I'd been following her career because she was perceived to be the voice of a kind of a rising neoconservative strain in the post-civil rights generation. She was very much about kind of bootstraps and kind of working her way through the system, getting education, all the conventional measures of achievement. But I realized that in following her Facebook posts, they were becoming more and more desperate. Finally, I saw that she was involved with the Occupy movement and was traveling from city to city. And when I was finally able to catch up with her, this is what she told me.
I am 53 years old, and 5 years ago, I would have been writing an op-ed for the Times that said, I failed to see how sleeping in pens is going to help. But in the last 5 or so years, I've had everything taken away from me by the 1%. My parents were Jim Crow sharecroppers, no education. I dragged myself with distinction and honors all the way, bachelor's, master's, Harvard Law, enlisted to officer, you know, Golden Girl. And now I am living in a homeless shelter. I haven't had any money for the last year. So that's why I'm an occupier. I came to understand that I meant nothing.
So is she typical? Well, of course not. I mean, very few people who are children of sharecroppers, I feel like I can say this with confidence, very few sort of children of sharecroppers go on to become Harvard Law School graduates and decorated Air Force officers and then become homeless. But it's important to pay attention to the stories of people who are able to tell them in their own words, because very often, even if they're not typical, they are clues to something that is typical, and that is something that we are still trying to unpack. We do know that the questions of why some people are advancing and some people are stuck in place are important, and we do know that the stories of why some groups have less economic stability than even their parents do is important. And we do know that that story, which is an ongoing story, is an issue of major concern, and it's something that we have to pay attention to. Now, there are, of course, all kinds of theories. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I bet many of you talk about over the dinner table at some point or another. At least in my house, this is the kind of thing that we tend to talk about at some point when we all get together. One of the big debates, of course, is family structure. It's kind of a chicken and egg debate, right? Are some people poorer because they are more likely to be divorced or never married? Or are some people poorer, or are they divorced or not married because they are poor? I messed that up, so I'm going to say it again. Are some people poorer because they are more likely to be divorced or never married? Or are they divorced or never married because they are poor? And this is a very important and sticky conversation. It's the kind of thing that kind of pushes all kinds of kind of racial buttons and judgment buttons, and it's the kind of thing that kind of, you want to be kind of careful who you have that conversation with, right? Because you don't want to be perceived as saying the wrong thing, or you don't want to ask questions that you think maybe you don't really have the right to ask. Well, that's our job. It's our job to ask those questions. And it's our job to offer you some new ways of thinking about old problems like this, and problems that have been old problems but are taking on new forms. So here I want to introduce you to an interesting scholar that I met, that we had on my program, Tell Me More. His name is Ivory Toldson. He holds a doctorate in counseling psychology. He's a professor at Howard University. He's currently working on a White House initiative around historically black colleges and universities. He's interested in this question of marriage rates, and he's interested in the question about why marriage rates are as low as they are among African Americans.
The reality is that marriage rates among African Americans are at its lowest point in history. But the way that it's presented in the media, it does a few things that deceives people of the true nature of the problem. So one factor is urbanization. If you live in an urban environment, you are less likely to be married, no matter what race you are. However, we have more African Americans clustered in urban centers. Another factor is economics. The less money you have, the less likely you are to be married. And I think that's because of some of those factors related to the kind of lifestyle you envision having as a married person. And so I think that when we look at the factors that bring down marriage, it's obvious that there are factors that are to our detriment that is causing that lower marriage rates. It's not the types of things that they're talking about in the media. The media likes tabloid type information.
All right, we could have a whole session on that statement, but we can have a whole comment about that. But the main thing that I want to suggest to you is that the work that you help to support and that we are trying to do, it's very important to get beyond the kinds of easy storylines that you are so often hearing, because often, as Lulu pointed out and as Gregory pointed out, often the way people perceive a situation up close is very different from the way it's reported out and becomes kind of a larger national story. It's really important to keep our hands on those kinds of stories, even if we don't agree with them. And this is not a warrant for any particular point of view. Let me be very clear about that. But it is important that we hear from people in discussing their own lives and how they perceive their own lives, as well as how they are perceived by others, as well as how it affects kind of the country and, in fact, the world. And one of the perspectives that we've been talking about on a number of desks and shows are how the mechanics of everyday life can be very different for different people. What might seem benign or even good public policy to somebody with the kind of lifestyle that I have. Imposing fines for small crimes, for example, instead of ordering jail time. I mean by that nonviolent crimes. I mean things like shoplifting, imposing fines for that. Now that might seem like really good public policy. You know, why would you send somebody to jail for that? But as our colleagues in the investigative unit have been reporting on closely, that can have very different consequences for different people, as they found out when they introduced us to a man in Augusta, Georgia, named Tom Barrett, and he tells us what happened to him.
I had to wear this monitor either for 6 months, pay $12 a day for 6 months, or spend 12 months in jail for stealing 1 can of beer. That doesn't seem like justice to me. I mean, I should not have taken that beer. I was dead wrong. But to spend 12 months in jail for stealing 1 can of beer, I just didn't seem right.
If you were wondering Tom's backstory, Tom is actually a pharmacist who unfortunately developed a drug addiction, and in the throes of his addiction, stole that 1 can of beer, and he was in fact sentenced to 12 months in jail, not for stealing that can of beer, but because he couldn't pay the court-imposed fines. So let me close on this thought. We often do these stories, I think, with a sense that the people we're talking about are very different from ourselves. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I think a lot of us are, I'll speak for myself, are attracted to journalism, because it kind of, this will shock you, but I'm actually a shy person. And I actually needed an excuse to talk to people that I was afraid of or didn't already know. I think that's why I was attracted to the field. In fact, Lulu asked me before we came in here, do I still get nervous? I said, what are you talking about? I'm terrified right now. But sometimes, it's important to realize that a lot of times when we think we're reporting on people who are very different from us, we really aren't. You come across a story, you think, you know what, not so fast. And now I want to leave you with Darlena Cunha. She lives in Gainesville, Florida now, and we called her to ask about a piece that she wrote that intrigued us. It was about what happened when she drove her husband's Mercedes to go pick up her food stamps.
I think human beings have the right to get assistance when they need it and eat, and I feel like I have no judgment about that. And yet when it happened to me, I judged myself. That is really hard to work with, especially when you're trying to now dig out and move forward, because you're dragging yourself down because there's this undercurrent of not hatred, but self-sadness and disappointment. There's an undercurrent of disappointment in yourself that shouldn't be there, because this crash affected the housing market and job market and everyone, and I think a lot of individuals thought it was their fault.
2 little babies, both born prematurely. Her husband and she both laid off while she was pregnant. The Mercedes, bought secondhand, still in good shape, totally paid off, paid for with cash. Babies have to eat. Got to go pick up those. Actually, it was WIC, for those of you who understand. It wasn't food stamps, it's WIC. Women in, so just to be clear, we know it was WIC. But, so how are you going to go, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave the car at home, or are you going to go pick up that WIC and go feed those babies? And she went to go pick up the food to feed those babies. And you can imagine the reception that she got. But she did what she had to do. So the question that I have, are we going to do what we have to do and pay attention? So there it is.